They say some moments haunt you forever. You could be walking through life, minding your own business, and then boom. One conversation. One decision. And suddenly, you're staring at the shattered pieces of the world you thought you knew. It's been 3 years since that night I sat at my kitchen table, looking across at my stepson, completely unaware that his next words would change everything. I didn't see it coming. I didn't feel the ground shifting beneath me. But that's the thing about life, isn't it? The biggest moments, the ones that leave scars sometimes, they start off so small. A quiet evening. A simple question. And yet, here I am, still asking myself, should I have answered differently? That night, I remember it so clearly. My husband had already gone to bed, typical. He never stayed up late anymore, never waited for me to come to bed. It was like we were living 2 separate lives under the same roof. I had grown used to the loneliness. I was sitting at the kitchen table, just scrolling on my phone, lost in my own world, when I heard footsteps. Slow, hesitant. And then I saw him, my stepson. I smiled at him, expecting him to just grab a drink from the fridge and go back to his room, but he didn't. Instead, he hovered in the doorway, looking at me like he was debating something. "What's up?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He hesitated. Then, finally, he stepped forward and sat across from me. "Can I ask you something?" Something in his voice made me pause. It wasn't the usual casual, throwaway question. This was different. He was nervous, maybe even a little embarrassed. "Of course," I said, setting my phone down. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's kinda personal." I smiled, trying to ease whatever tension he was feeling. "That's okay. Shoot." And then, the question. The one that I never saw coming. "How did you know? When you were ready?" "You know, for your first time?" I felt my breath catch. My heart skipped, just for a second. Not because of the question itself, but because of the way he asked it. The way his eyes stayed on me, searching for something more than just an answer. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I was caught completely off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked me something like that, so long since I had even thought about it. And in that moment, in that quiet kitchen, with only the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of my husband snoring down the hall, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt seen. I should have just given him a simple answer. I should have laughed it off, kept it short, kept it safe. But I didn't. I leaned forward. And the words that came out of my mouth shocked even me. But before I tell you what happened next, if you love real, raw, and shocking stories, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga and hit that notification bell. This story is one you're not going to forget. The words slipped from my mouth before I could even think. It's different for everyone. My voice came out softer than I expected. My stepson leaned in slightly, listening, waiting, like what I had to say actually mattered. I took a slow breath, gathering my thoughts. What was I supposed to say? Give him some generic, parent-approved answer? Tell him to wait for the right person? That felt dishonest. I'd been married for 15 years, and if I'd learned anything in that time, it was that the right person didn't always stay the right person. Love changes. People change. And sometimes you end up feeling more alone in a marriage than you ever did when you were single. I looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't a kid anymore. His shoulders had broadened, his jaw had sharpened, but there was still something soft about him. Something untouched. Innocent, even. "What made you ask me this?" I finally said. He hesitated. "I don't know. I guess I just..." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You're easy to talk to." I swallowed. That shouldn't have meant as much as it did. But it did. My husband didn't talk to me like this anymore. Somewhere along the way, the long, deep conversations had stopped. Now, our interactions were mostly just about schedules, bills, what to pick up from the store. But my stepson, he was here, sitting in front of me, trusting me, wanting my opinion. I hadn't realized how much I had been starving for something like this. Being ready, I said, choosing my words carefully, isn't just about whether you love someone. Sometimes, it's about whether you're ready for what comes after. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I exhaled. Once you cross that line with someone, things change. You see them differently. They see you differently. And sometimes, I hesitated. Sometimes, you don't know if you made the right choice until it's too late. He stared at me for a long moment. The dim kitchen light cast shadows on his face, highlighting the sharp edges of his cheekbones, the thoughtful furrow of his brow. Did you regret yours? He asked. My throat tightened. I wasn't expecting that. I could have lied. I should have lied. But the words that came out next weren't rehearsed. They weren't careful. Not at first. His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to ask more, but he didn't. Instead, he just nodded, absorbing my words. There was a silence between us then, not uncomfortable, but charged. I felt it in the air, in the way he kept his eyes on me a second longer than he needed to, in the way my heart had started beating just a little faster. I forced myself to look away to break whatever was happening. I glanced at the clock. 1:12 a.m. You should get some sleep, I said quickly, pushing back from the table. It's late. He studied me for a second before nodding. But as he stood up, he hesitated. Thanks for talking to me, he said. I managed a small smile. Always. Then, just as he turned toward the hallway, I felt it, his hand, grazing against mine. Light. Barely there. But enough to make my stomach flip. Enough to make my breath hitch. And for the first time in years, I felt something I wasn't sure I was supposed to feel. I stood there for a moment, staring at my hand like it wasn't even mine. The warmth of his touch still lingered, light as it was, but heavy in the way it settled in my chest. My breath felt uneven, my skin tingling with something I couldn't quite name. I shook it off. It was nothing, just a moment. An accident. I turned off the kitchen light, the room falling into darkness except for the sliver of moonlight seeping in through the window. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of my husband snoring from down the hall. Everything should have felt normal. Routine. But it didn't. I laid in bed that night staring at the ceiling, my husband's back turned to me like always. My mind kept replaying the conversation, his voice, the way he looked at me, like my words actually mattered. You're easy to talk to. God, when was the last time someone had said that to me? When was the last time anyone had really seen me? I closed my eyes, willing sleep to take me, to push these thoughts away. But even in the darkness, I could still feel it. The warmth of his hand. The next day, I told myself it was just a conversation. Nothing more. But I was lying. Because something had shifted. And deep down, I knew. I'd felt it too. It happened again a few nights later. Another late night. Another quiet house. Another moment I should have walked away from. My husband had fallen asleep early again. I had stopped waiting up for him years ago. There was no point anymore. He barely even noticed. I was in the kitchen again, sipping on a cup of tea, lost in my own thoughts when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps. I knew it was him before I even turned around. Can't sleep? I asked, keeping my voice light. He shrugged, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. Nah, just thinking. I nodded, watching as he leaned against the counter. Thinking about what? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. That night, what we talked about. My stomach tightened. I forced myself to stay still, to keep my expression neutral. Oh! Yeah, he said, eyes flickering to me. I keep going over what you said. About how things change after. He paused, as if debating his next words. Did it change for you? After your first time? I swallowed. Yes. How? His voice was quiet, careful, but there was something beneath it. Something deeper. I should have ended the conversation there. I should have laughed it off, told him it wasn't important, told him to wait until he found someone he truly cared about. But I didn't. Instead, I exhaled slowly and let the truth slip out. I realized that sometimes what we think we want isn't always what we need. His gaze locked onto mine, searching, like he was trying to read between the lines. And sometimes, I added, my voice barely above a whisper, we don't realize we made a mistake until it's too late. He didn't look away. Neither did I. And that was the moment. That was when everything shifted. Because in that silence, in the space between us, something unspoken passed between our eyes. Something dangerous. Something neither of us should have been feeling. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, my husband lying beside me, oblivious, breathing heavily in his deep sleep. I should have felt safe here, should have felt comforted by his presence. But all I felt was nothing. The conversation kept replaying in my head. The way my stepson looked at me. The way he listened, really listened, hanging on to every word, like what I had to say mattered. It had been so long since I felt that. Since I felt like someone actually saw me. And yet, deep inside, something twisted. This was wrong, wasn't it? I told myself it was nothing. Just a conversation. Just a boy looking for guidance. He trusted me, looked up to me. And yet, the warmth of his gaze lingered on my skin long after he had left the room. I turned onto my side, staring at the darkened wall. Why did this feel different? I tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me relentless. My mind drifted back to when I was younger, to when I was the one asking those questions, looking for answers, desperate to understand love, intimacy, and everything in between. I remembered my first time. How nervous I was, how convinced I had made the right choice. How I believed, with every fiber of my being, that love would last forever. But it didn't. Love faded. Passion died. People stopped looking at you the way they used to. I turned again, pressing my forehead against my pillow, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'm just giving him guidance. This is innocent, right? But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew the truth. It wasn't just the conversation that was making my chest tighten. It was the way he had looked at me. The way his presence had made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. Desired. And that was the most dangerous part of all. Because I wasn't just a parental figure to him in that moment. I was a woman. A woman who had been lonely for too long. A woman who had spent years feeling invisible. And he saw me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the thoughts creeping into my mind. This wasn't right. I was his stepmother. I was supposed to protect him, guide him, steer him in the right direction. Not whatever this was. But the problem with forbidden thoughts is that once they exist, you can't erase them. You can try to push them down, smother them, pretend they don't exist. But they don't disappear. They linger. And the more you try to ignore them, the stronger they become. The next few days, I told myself things would go back to normal. That whatever I had felt that night, whatever had shifted between us, was just in my head. A moment of weakness. A fleeting thought. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Because everything felt different now. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he lingered in the kitchen just a little longer than necessary. And the worst part? I didn't stop him. I should have created distance, should have reinforced boundaries, should have pretended that night had never happened. But I didn't. Because I liked it. I liked how it felt to be seen again. It started off small. Little things. Things I could pretend were innocent. One night, I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, watching something mindless on TV. My husband was, once again, holed up in his office, working late. I didn't even hear my stepson come in until he spoke. That looks boring. I turned, startled, and saw him standing in the doorway, smirking. It is, I admitted, setting my glass down. He hesitated for a second before walking in and dropping onto the couch beside me. Not too close, but closer than usual. Why are you watching it then? I sighed. Force of habit, I guess. I expected him to laugh, to make a joke about how old I sounded. But he didn't. He just studied me, like he was trying to figure something out. You always seem. I don't know. Lonely? The word hit harder than I expected. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. I'm not lonely. He didn't say anything at first. Then, quietly, yeah, you are. I swallowed. There was something about the way he said it. Not with pity. Not with judgment. Just truth. I wanted to argue, wanted to push back, but the words stuck in my throat. Because he wasn't wrong. Move over, he said suddenly, nudging me lightly with his elbow. I blinked. What? You take up the whole couch. I rolled my eyes but shifted slightly. He plopped down beside me, closer now, our arms almost touching. I told myself it was nothing, that this was normal. But then, he reached for the remote, his fingers brushing against mine. I could have pulled away. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. And in that tiny, seemingly insignificant moment, something inside me shifted. From that night on, things were different. We spent more time together. It started as nothing, him staying in the room longer when we talked, us watching TV together some nights when my husband was locked away in his own world. But then, the teasing started. You're terrible at picking movies, he'd say, shaking his head. Oh, shut up, I'd laugh, nudging his arm. And then one night, I threw a pillow at him playfully. He caught it and grinned. Oh, so that's how it is? Before I could react, he tossed it back, light, playful, nothing serious. But when I reached for it, I lost my balance. And suddenly, I was falling. Straight into him. My hand landed on his chest, my face inches from his. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I expected him to pull away, to laugh it off, to make a joke. But he didn't. He just looked at me. And in that moment, I felt it. The shift. The change. The thing neither of us wanted to admit was happening. It lasted only a second. A single, fleeting second. But it was enough. Because we both knew. There was no going back now. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed, shaken it off, turned the moment into something harmless. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, my palm resting against his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. His breathing was deep, controlled, but there was something else there, something unspoken, just beneath the surface. We were too close. The room felt smaller. The silence between us heavier. I swallowed, my mind screaming at me to move, to put distance between us, to pretend this had never happened. But my body betrayed me. He didn't pull away either. His gaze stayed locked onto mine, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. A question, a hesitation, a moment that should never have existed. And then, his voice, low, quiet. You're different from the others. A chill ran down my spine. You actually listen. You actually care. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because I knew what he meant. I knew what he was really saying. I had felt it too. The way we had started drifting closer, like it was happening in slow motion, like gravity itself had shifted, pulling us into dangerous territory. I should have stopped it. I should have stood up, laughed it off, done something to break the tension. But instead, I whispered, I know. And that was all it took. The air between us crackled, charged with something neither of us were prepared for. I felt his breath against my skin, warm, steady, waiting. This wasn't supposed to happen. This couldn't happen. But I had been starving for so long. Starving to be seen. To be heard. To be wanted. And in that moment, I wasn't his stepmother. I was just a woman. A woman who had been neglected. A woman who had been lonely for years. A woman on the edge of a mistake she couldn't take back. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I should have said something. Should have put an end to this. But then, his hand. Light. Barely there. Resting just over mine. A touch that wasn't innocent. A touch that lingered. A touch that told me he felt it too. And just like that, the line was gone. Crossed. Erased. Irreversible. The second our hands touched, the world seemed to stop. And then, just as suddenly, it started spinning again. Too fast. Too loud. Too real. I pulled my hand back like I had been burned. The warmth of his skin still lingered against my fingertips, but I couldn't look at him. I couldn't. Silence crashed down between us. Heavy. Suffocating. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he exhaled sharply, shifting back as if breaking whatever invisible force had held us in place. I should go, he muttered, his voice unsteady. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He stood quickly, almost knocking over the pillow on the couch. His hands clenched at his sides. He didn't look at me. And then, just like that, he was gone. The room felt impossibly empty without him. I sat there for a long time, staring at my hands, at the space where his touch had been. My heart was still racing, my stomach twisted into knots. What have I done? I barely slept that night. When I finally dragged myself out of bed the next morning, I felt like I was moving through a fog. My husband was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, scrolling through his phone like he did every morning. Morning, he said absently, not even looking up. Morning, I mumbled, my voice hoarse. I felt off, unsteady, like I was still standing too close to the edge of something dangerous. And then I saw him, my stepson. He walked into the kitchen slowly, like he wasn't sure how to act. Like the weight of last night was still pressing down on him. He glanced at me, just for a second. And then he looked away. He didn't say anything, didn't make eye contact, didn't even acknowledge me. The shift was instant. Where before, there had been teasing, warmth, something now, there was only tension. He moved around the kitchen stiffly, grabbing a bowl, pouring cereal, his every movement deliberate. Careful, like he was afraid of what might happen if he let his guard down. I opened my mouth to say something, to break the silence, to fix whatever was breaking between us. But before I could, my husband let out a small sigh, pushing back from the table. I have an early meeting. I'll be home late. Just like that, he was gone. He hadn't noticed the tension. Hadn't picked up on the way his son had barely looked at me. Hadn't seen the way my hands were gripping the edge of the counter, desperate to hold onto something solid. And why would he? This was just another day for him. Just another morning. Nothing had changed. Except, everything had. The rest of the day dragged by in a haze. I couldn't focus on anything. My thoughts kept circling back to the night before. The moment. The mistake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. The way he looked at me. The way he pulled away. The regret in his eyes. God, what had I done? I kept telling myself that it wasn't that bad. That nothing really happened. That I had just let things go too far for a second. But that was a lie. Because something had happened. Something unspoken. Something dangerous. And now, I didn't know how to make it go away. I kept waiting for him to say something, to pull me aside, to talk, to acknowledge that the air between us had changed. But he didn't. He avoided me. He kept his distance. He went back to treating me like I was just a stepmother. Like I was no one. And for some reason, that hurt more than anything. I sat alone that evening, staring at the empty glass of wine in front of me, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on my chest. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. My husband was still at work. My stepson was in his room. And I was left alone with the thoughts I had been trying all day to push away. I kept going over it, dissecting every moment. Every glance. Every touch. Every feeling. Was it my fault? Did I let my loneliness cloud my judgment? I wanted to believe it was innocent. That it was just a fleeting moment that didn't mean anything. But I knew better. I could still feel it. The electricity in the air. The hesitation. The way neither of us had moved. The way neither of us had wanted to. That wasn't normal. That wasn't nothing. I picked up my glass, realized it was empty, and set it back down with a sigh. It was just a conversation. I whispered it out loud, as if saying it would make it true. But if it was just a conversation, why did I feel like I had crossed a line? Why did my stomach twist every time I thought about his voice, his eyes, the way he had looked at me like I was someone worth listening to? This wasn't just about my marriage. This was about me. About something missing inside me. Something I had ignored for too long. When was the last time I had felt wanted? When was the last time someone had looked at me like I was more than just a wife, a mother, an obligation? I used to be passionate. I used to feel alive. I used to be someone who laughed easily, who flirted without guilt, who felt desired. And then, somewhere along the way, I had disappeared. I had become invisible. My husband didn't see me anymore. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't notice when I wore a new dress or when I tried to reach for him in the middle of the night. And maybe, in some dark, desperate way, I had liked that my stepson had noticed. The thought made my stomach drop. I pressed my palms to my face, breathing deeply, trying to steady myself. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't that woman. I was just lonely. That's all this was. A moment of weakness. A mistake. Nothing more. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew the truth. Because if it was just a mistake, why was I still thinking about it? I don't know how long I sat there, lost in my thoughts. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't feel real anymore. It just stretched and warped around me, thick and heavy, like a weight I couldn't shake off. But I knew one thing. Something had changed inside me that night. Something I couldn't take back. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again. That whatever this was, whatever had nearly happened between us, it was over. But the truth? I wasn't sure if I wanted it to be. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Have you ever been in a situation where emotions got confusing? Where loneliness made you question yourself, your choices, your own morality? Because that's what happened to me. I never thought I'd find myself here. Never thought I'd feel the things I felt that night. But loneliness is a strange thing. It makes you see people differently. It makes you crave attention, affection, anything that reminds you you're still here, still worth something. And sometimes, it makes you cross lines you never thought you would. I want to know, what would you have done? Would you have walked away before things got complicated? Or would you have let yourself slip, just for a moment, into the warmth of something dangerous? Tell me in the comments. I need to hear what you think. And if you want more real, jaw-dropping stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. You don't want to miss what happens next. Because trust me, this story, it's far from over. Loneliness can push you into places you never thought you'd go. It's quiet at first. Innocent. A longing, an ache, a whisper in the back of your mind. And then, before you realize it, you're standing on the edge of something dangerous. And you don't know whether to run or let yourself fall. Be careful who you turn to for comfort. Because sometimes, you might find yourself walking a path you can't return from.